today we're talking about strategic data governance, and I've got with me today Jeff Popova Clark.
Yeah, you got
Who's
it right.
going to be talking to well, that's all the practice I had. So,
Yeah.
and we're talking about strategic data governance, and it is one of those key things that's not really talked about in the media. You hear about cybersecurity threats, and you hear about potential data leakage through cybersecurity, but really the strategic data governance is where you can reduce the amount of data leakage. You can bring in controls. You can bring in the ability to really improve things with your staff and the like. So, talking about strategic data governance today. What is strategic data governance?
Okay,
Take it away.
look, it has been a big period where we're starting to bring this in. Obviously, regulations moving with regards to privacy, and that's bringing this to the forefront. We've also had a lot of cybersecurity threats. You may be aware of some of the big ones that have happened with Medicare and Medibank and Optus in more recent times. But in reality, data governance is quite wide and includes things like our ability to utilise our data effectively within our organisations. So things like the definition of data, how it's flowing through your organisation, so what it's going to be used for, what the actual, who owns that data, and how it is fit for purpose in terms of its quality for usage. So all of those fit underneath the concepts of data governance, as well as things such as the ability to make money from your data. You want to do that in a way that's both ethical and doesn't increase the risk to your organisation. So all of those things fit under the data governance banner, and we'll probably talk through that in the use case today, which we're going to talk. But which is going to be a large telecommunications organisation within Australia, where we've been spending the last couple of years doing an implementation of that, and although it's quite effective for quite a large number of organisations across multiple industries, telecommunications, like banking, is very data rich, and therefore I think is a useful case study for us today.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested about that because I think what you're saying around the data governance is it's that thing that you need in the organisation, but you're not talking about it as much. But I've noticed in the last 12 months there's been a real ascendancy with that. I know how you started up that data governance community of practice
A couple of years ago, yeah.
yeah, and it's really from that point, it's really increased. And one of the things now is I've run 2 data governance courses, and they're just booked out straight away. So it is really becoming important. And I think one of the other things about strategic data governance, it is to align it to the business objectives, your strategic
Absolutely.
objectives. You may have a data strategy. Data governance actually has its own stream on that data strategy now. It's that important. It's as important as some of the other things like metadata management, master data management, and creation of the data platform. Yeah. So with that case study, I know that's good you brought that case study up. With that case study, can you outline, what was the problems that started, in the organisation, and how did you get to the, objective of being able to improve data governance for the organisation?
Sounds like a good segue, mate. Look, we, like most organisations within both Australia and globally, we had over 1,500 applications that we'd been collecting pretty much since IT first was a boy. And so what's happened as a result is that there's literally hundreds of interfaces between systems. So many of those are not reconciled. We don't really know where all the data is flowing. We certainly don't know where all the sensitive data is, like personal information. You got some anecdotal evidence and some areas that people know of that's high profile, but that doesn't mean you've got it all. Some of the new legislation, for instance, is asking us to forget. Now, what does forget mean is one of the questions, but I'm pretty sure what it means is they want to purge the information from the system. But what does that mean? We don't really know. But one thing's for sure: before you can purge it, you got to know where it is. Other things is like when we're doing our reporting and our applications within our organisations, what we're finding is some of those are used for KPIs, and the amount that those KPIs are moving is bigger, not based on how reality is changing, but actually in terms of how definitions are changing. So as we find out things about both our system and the environment in which it's in, what's happening is we're having to modify the definition, and then suddenly, using sales as an example, we suddenly got 2% less sales last quarter, which of course makes everyone very upset because suddenly they're not hitting their KPIs, right?
No, exactly.
So you can imagine if that sort of thing is happening and making those KPIs move more quickly than the actual reality of how many sales you're making, you can see that that becomes an important issue as well. And of course, when regulators come in, they don't see you as a 1,500 applications with hundreds of data owners and lots of disaggregated data sets. They see you as a single entity. So when the judge says, thou shalt do X, they're expecting you to be able to do that across your entire data environment. But as we all know, in all our modern organisations, that's a big call to be able to do that. So data governance, as we saw in this particular use case, was trying to address a number of those issues, as well as many others. So you need these foundational elements in place in order to make you more effective. So you know what's going on in your organisation, you need to have trust in your data. In order to be able to meet your regulatory obligations, you need to know where the data is. In order to be able to understand what security controls you're going to place on what data, you need to know where that sensitive data is and what that sensitive data is, and therefore what controls need to be applied to it.
What's in it, basically.
Exactly. So this stuff, that's secret. So that stuff we should be encrypting and air gapping and all those wonderful controls. But this stuff, that's confidential. Might not need quite as much as we do for the secret, but it's still got to be, well encrypted, and only a few people can actually access it using user access management. Meanwhile, this other stuff, that's internal. We don't really want it getting out in the public. But this other stuff over here, well, that's available in the public realm. So that doesn't matter if that leaks. So different levels of controls are needed for each of those. And of course, you can see that that's very important for security. That you can apply the right security controls to the correct data. And of course, that means we're leaving the cybersecurity part, like the perimeter type stuff, we're leaving that to the cybersecurity professionals. But what we're doing is we're giving the risk information to the cybersecurity professionals so they know what controls to apply to what data.
I guess key, once you find out where all those data sources are, the key would be to find out, who owns them.
And that is actually the biggest problem. Because we all talk about data ownership. And one of the things we found in this particular use case in this large telco company was that it's great to be theoretical and say, look, we have a content domain of, say, customer, or a content domain of asset or whatever. And of course, that goes across hundreds of different applications. But at the end of the day, it's not very practical, because it becomes down to lots of arguments about who's really responsible for it. Everyone wants to get the kudos and the credit for the business outcomes, but no one wants to take on the responsibility and be responsible when something goes wrong. So you can just imagine the difficulty of that. So we quickly realised that domains was not a really great way. It sounds great in theory, but it doesn't really work. So the approach we took was twofold. Number one was we used systems, because it's very clear which system is which. Now, the difficulty of just sticking with that is some systems have many owners. And so therefore, who is funding that change? And the other part about problem with systems is many source systems end up, the data flows into secondary systems downstream. So they might flow into your data platform, for instance, or your visualization, or your data models, your behavioral models, your upselling, your cross-selling, your credit fraud risk, and so on. There's lots and lots of ways that data gets used that is outside of the purview of the owner of the original system that generated or entered the data. So then what ended up happening was we decided that we could go to the other end and do data products. So it was fairly simple to understand for every data product, because most data products is for a specific business purpose and therefore had a data owner. And then we had to go in both directions. Data product had to go back to the provenance of the data, and then from the data system, we had to flow the lineage back up to the data products. And from that, we were able to identify who owned what, and therefore who had the most responsibility for identifying problems in that data, funding that data, and making changes to the data capture and the data transformation processes along the way. Data cleansing, for instance, another piece of that.
Yeah.
So that's on the data ownership side of things. So you can imagine there was quite a bit to do there. I think it's really important to understand too, and it was one thing that we realised quite quickly, because in that organisation they had a fairly mature data governance team working for about 3 or 4 years. And frankly, it hadn't really been working.
Right.
And the main reason is because firstly, they were primarily concentrating on the data platforms without taking into account the data sources, which is actually where most of your data governance problems come from.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, you can't solve this stuff with half a dozen people sitting in the centre of your organisation, maybe in IT or in regulatory affairs.
It wasn't decentralised at all. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So what we needed to do was we needed, a bit like workplace health and safety, we needed to make sure that these people were firstly incentivised to do something on behalf of the whole organisation. So you can imagine if you've got the sales staff, they're sitting there in their call centre, and they're KPI'd on getting a sale, and also keeping their average handling time, AHT, down, right? And moving on to the next sale as quickly as possible. So if that means not collecting some of the data that might get used by behavioural models, or might get used by the reporting and analytics folks, or might get used for the credit fraud risk people, if those things aren't brought forward into that source system, that data is not going to get captured.
Right.
Because they're incentivised to not capture it. So we had to balance out the KPIs and the incentives for our data source, data ingestion parts of the organisation, to make sure that they are capturing the data that's needed for the rest of the organisation. And that was quite a big change. The other part that was really important to that too is that we had an entire program management office process, and that was relatively mature in this organisation too, which was a real benefit, right? So what ended up happening was, though, they did not have all of those areas of data included post the actual issue, the initiative that was being run. So normally, if we use an example of, say, an asset management part, so they might get an asset management system or an upgrade to their asset management system. They're only going to collect the data that's needed to do the asset management. And they haven't until recently been caring about how that asset management data is going to get extracted from that asset management system, go into ETL process, extract, transfer, load processes, or ELT these days, and then move into the data platform or into the visualizations or models or whatever the data products are.
So they had it in that base system.
Yep.
They hadn't moved it over the warehouse or the.
Well, they might have moved the data, but when they did the change to the asset management system, they didn't take into account all those downstream things that were happening. They were only caring about the asset management team and how the asset management team were going to use that data for doing asset management. They weren't thinking about the rest of the organisation.
Once it's combined, the information's combined with financial data and everything else.
Exactly. And or other asset management data from other asset management systems, right? It just wasn't considered. So as a result, what we needed to do is also, once again, incentivise the people who were doing the upgrade to the asset management system, but to make sure that they cared about the rest of the organisation. And then secondly, we needed to give them some tools within the program management office process that would allow them to assess the impact that this new capability, this new data was going to have on the rest of the organisation, and ensure that's included in the solution architecture for this upgrade or replacement or whatever it is that they're doing. So that was another big change in that organisation, and something they'd never done before. So so you can see this is quite substantial. So moving on, one of the other things that was really pushed in this particular use case was that and I think this was mainly the very senior executive, were really hoping that they could just employ a super person, Captain Privacy or super security person, or whoever it was, right? They really wanted that person to just come in and be the all-knowing person who would just make it all happen. A couple were tried, and what ended up happening was they found out that no, it's not as simple as just bringing in a super expert who sounds like they're very powerful and very wonderful and all that sort of thing. It's a hard job.
Yes.
And the other side of that is also there's no magic wand, right? So we did try a couple of magic wands. As you can imagine, I was probably a little bit skeptical at the beginning because I don't believe in these things, but many of the senior executive did. And so we did try some pilots. One in particular was trying to find, and it was useful for some use cases, trying to find some of our sensitive data that was flowing between the systems. So for instance, personal information. So what we were able to do was monitor the networks to see where that data was coming from and where it was going to. And that was a great double check. But there was a lot of data that was sitting within individual systems that never flowed between systems.
Right.
And so that became really obvious when much of the stuff that we knew about was already there, was not being picked up by that flow type approach. So there was no ability to just get rid of all of your glossaries and your catalogs and get a network monitoring tool that's going to do that. However, the network monitoring tool was a good augmentation to that because it helped us find some things that we didn't know about. Yeah, absolutely. So that's a useful part of the use case as well. Now, another part is once we realised that we couldn't do this as a central team, we needed to then empower the rest of the organisation. So how did we do that? Well, number one, we started with a bunch of policies so that we could give them a set of standards and guidelines and pro forma and templates and best practice lists and all those kinds of useful facilitators. I called them accelerators because what that does is it helps people do things more efficiently and effectively. We also put together a bunch of forums so that parts of the organisation could learn from each other. And obviously the central team was the lead. I called them the centre of enablement to make sure that they were enabling the rest of the organisation.
Did that involve meetings, or was it more like a sort of Teams environment to go to?
Yeah, so there was, I mean, it is a distributed organisation across Australia, so and a little bit overseas. So essentially what ended up happening was there was forums and there was physical turning up. And at the beginning, for the first few of these forums, it was the central team that did the presentations and generally about the accelerators actually. Is what
to get that information out there.
And just to get a bit of a cadence going and get an attendance going. And then what ended up happening was we really worked hard to make sure that people outside of the central areas, so the individual business units who were nominated by the data owners to do this sort of work, we called them data owner stewards. They weren't stewards, or champions is probably the best word. Because there is custodians and there's stewards, but they've got different meanings. But the key is that those people represented the data owners at these forums, and so we made sure they were turning up and they started to do presentations. And so now it's a thriving forum.
Those people, are they experts in their the knowledge of data, or are they fairly senior?
So there's a mixture. It depends on what part of the organisation, and some areas we were more happy with than others, and some areas were more mature in terms of actually employing an actual data steward, which was really useful because the data stewards were actual professionals in the area, and so they were real champions of it.
Did you need a lead data steward for all of them across the organisation?
Yeah. So in the end, what the final model will be, at the moment we've got most of the data stewards that we had in the central team sitting in that big uplift project that's going on. But eventually they're going to be distributed back out to the business units, and some of the business units, because of the change to the KPIs we've made, have actually taken, instead of hiring another 2 sales staff, they've hired a data steward, which was great. But you needed that incentive in place, otherwise they would never have done that. So the key is that we've got those data champions. Many of them are just senior people who have a big interest in data. Some of them are people who are reporting and analytics specialists. And ideally it was data stewards that were the ones that we would have preferred, and that because they were the most active members in the forum.
They had that knowledge, those subject matter experts that knew what they were doing.
Absolutely. And when I say incentive too, there's both the positive carrot type incentive for your KPIs and your bonuses, and also public praise and things like that. We had newsletters and talked about those parts of the business that were adopting things successfully, or having big uplifts in something like, say, data quality or something measurable. But we also had the compliance side. So whilst we got the policies going and the standards, what we did is we made sure that internal audit. We also had a regulatory review area. Now they were primarily interested in the parts that were regulatory, right? Which is a goodly part of data governance is covered by that. And then we had a specialist data governance review team as well set up. So we had three review teams that were available, and we set up the equivalent of what's called an audit universe in the internal audit area, and made sure that across those three teams there was going to be some compliance pressure placed across the entire organisation. Now, I'm talking like all of this has been implemented. This is the roadmap.
Yes,
We're on the way. We've only done a few of those audits to this point in time, but we've got the plan now, right?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. And I probably should just step back one little piece too and just talk about how we got such a major piece of work going, because one of the hardest parts is getting senior executive attention and then the resource allocation that comes with that. So when we first started, the main things we had, and this was this particular organisation did have a major data governance related event, which certainly increased senior executive attention on this particular topic.
And then I guess it's partially risk based.
Yeah, that's right. But what happened as part of this event too is it also it uncovered the covers on what actual data is in these systems. So most senior executives are thinking in terms of marketing and, we're going to use this data and we have a full understanding of the customer. Or
democratization of it,
Exactly. And so in their mind, that data is being captured and used every day. So it's beautiful data.
Yes.
But what they got to see as a result of this event was there's a lot of data that's very much out of date.
Yeah.
There's a lot of inconsistent data.
So data quality issues.
Data quality issues. They also started to understand that, hang on, in some of our reports, what we call a customer over here is actually a user over here and is actually an account holder over here. They're all different things, right? All being called customers. They're all being poured into one report as if it's one customer. And that sort of thing, you're telling them that stuff. But when the event happened, it became bleedingly obvious. So as a result, they suddenly realised how much effort was needed and how important this was. And this doesn't mean it was any more important in our use case organisation. It's the same in all organisations. It's just that we had the benefit of the event, and that had increased our resourcing by tenfold.
And I think the message for all organisations is to get on the front foot.
Yes.
Get this in place, and I guess it also links to BIA, business impact assessments, and your disaster recovery plans, and actually getting, because it's not just the event, isn't it? Like, it's how you respond.
Yes.
In straight away afterwards.
Absolutely. And look, I don't recommend, having lived through the event, that it's not something you want to go through.
No.
It's far better to be in a better place, and not just to mitigate the likelihood of it, but also to be more prepared for it, and also mitigate the consequences. But most importantly too, is that it wasn't just about the event. It was uncovering the knowledge firsthand of how much we're relying on this data on a daily basis. And then what ended up happening was it became very exposed just how wobbly that foundation is and how much we need to make sure those foundations are solid in order to be able to trust our KPI reports and trust our environmental reports, to know what's going on in our environment, and to be able to make business decisions on a daily basis if our data is not what we think it was, right? So that became very obvious.
Yeah, so some really good outcomes from what you've been talking about, Jeff. I think key is to make sure that you know where your data is, you know where it's located. You have that data life cycle. I think you still talked about at the start, that it actually has a creation date and a archiving date where it's got to go down. And then after that is to establish, your information owners, your data owners, and whether they're the senior executives that need to own the data, and you need those stewards and subject matter experts that are attached to this. But the clear message I get is you've got to get in on top of this early.
Yes.
And data governance is that important ingredient for every organisation that we need to establish, and it can help in sharing data safely and allow business to operate freely. So, yeah, thank you for coming along.
It's a pleasure.
It's been a great chat.
Yep.
And we'll have to
I feel
do it
like
again.
there's so much left unsaid, but look,
Yeah.
we can only fit so much in a few minutes.
Exactly. All right. Thank you.